it's Smalls.
And Tarzan. Welcome back to Kids Connection, where things are a little sticky this month.
However, this Sunday is a very special day. It has a long, fancy name, but we're just going to call it the AGM.
This is where the church comes together and looks at all the things it's done over the year and what it can continue to do moving forward.
Usually we get together, we talk, we eat lots of food and have a great time. And not just as our church family, everyone is welcome.
Like Small said, usually we get together, but unfortunately, that's not something we can do right now. However, I think the grown-ups have been watching our videos because they are determined to make sure the meeting still happens.
It was a sticky situation trying to figure out what to do, but luckily, we're going to do it over Zoom. Like we've been learning, God gives us the tools to get ourselves unstuck. We just need to figure out how to use them.
We have an extra special video for you this week. But speaking of using what God gave us, it's time to use our bodies and dance to the next song.
Tarzan and I have been determined to get outside of our comfort zones and try things that we couldn't do before. I made Tarzan do ballet.
And I made Smalls play basketball. Now, we are determined to do the impossible, or at least the near impossible. This is less of a sticky situation and more of a stick-y situation. Well, it's not actually a stick. It's a pen. So I have these two pens, and I have a water bottle.
Oh, I think I see where this is going.
Smalls, are you ready to do the impossible?
I definitely know where this is going.
We're going to try and get one of these pens through the hole of this water bottle. Sounds easy, but we're going to be doing it 2 meters away from each other and 2 2 meters away from the water bottle.
Tarzan, why?
Because we have determination, and it's the AGM. Let's do something extra special, extra challenging, extra dangerous, and maybe just a little extra for this super special day. Ready? Let's do it!
did it! It only took us over 150 tries. We didn't even show you all of them because there were so many tries. Even when it seemed way too hard and completely impossible, we chose to stick with it until we got it done.
God's story, Joseph. So part of God's story is about a guy named Joseph, and it begins like this. Once there was a guy named Joseph who had 10 older brothers and one younger one. When Joe was a boy, he was his dad's favorite. In fact, his dad liked him so much better than his brothers that he gave Joe a special gift to prove it. You can imagine this made his brothers jealous. And Joe only made things worse. He told his brothers about dreams he had where he was ruling over them. Well, this made Joe's brothers furious. One day they were working and saw Joe coming. They said, "Here comes that dreamer." They threw Joe into a dark pit. They might have left him there forever, but they met some men traveling from Egypt and sold Joe to them as a servant instead. They thought that was slightly nicer than leaving him in a pit. Then they went home and told their father Joe had been killed by a wild animal. This broke their dad's heart. Kids, these brothers were really bad news. Selling a sibling is never a good idea, ever. But the Bible says the Lord was with Joe. When Joe was a servant, he worked for a really important rich guy named Potiphar. And Potiphar liked Joe so much, he put him in charge of the whole house. Joe was happy until one day he was blamed for something he didn't do, and Potiphar sent him straight to jail. Well, God was still with Joe, even in prison. The guard decided he liked Joe so much, he put him in charge of all the other prisoners. Then God gave Joe special knowledge about dreams. When two prisoners had dreams, Joe knew what they meant, so he told them. 2 years later, Egypt's ruler called Pharaoh had a dream, and nobody knew what it meant. But by now, one of the two prisoners Joe had helped was out of jail and working for Pharaoh. He told Pharaoh about Joe, and God helped Joe figure out what Pharaoh's dream meant. But Pharaoh's dream was really more of a nightmare. It meant that everybody in Egypt would have food for 7 years, then be hungry for 7 years. Joe told Pharaoh the only way to survive was to store food during the 7 good years. Well, Pharaoh thought Joe's idea was brilliant. He put him in charge. During the 7 hungry years, nobody could eat without getting food from Joe. He was like a human vending machine. Well, remember how Joe had 11 brothers? Like everybody else, they had to get food from Joe. And when they came, they didn't even recognize their brother. But Joe knew who they were. He secretly tested them to see if they changed. After all, they did throw him in a pit and sell him. Finally, he couldn't hide who he was from his brothers anymore. He told everyone to leave the room because he was about to cry. After sobbing for a few minutes, he told them, "I'm your brother Joseph. I'm the one you sold." The brothers couldn't believe it. They had hurt Joe, but God had taken care of him during the good times and the bad. Even with everything they had done to Joe, he forgave them because he was willing to follow God, even when it was hard. Joe told them, "You planned to harm me, but God planned it for good." And God used Joe to save many lives, including the family that was part of God's special rescue plan. And that's the story of Joseph. So in case you missed it, here's the quick version. Joe was his dad's favorite. His brothers sold him. Potiphar put Joe in charge. Joe was sent to jail. The guard put Joe in charge. Pharaoh had a bad dream. Joe told him what it meant. Pharaoh put Joe in charge. Joe's brothers had to come to him for food. Joe forgave them. This was part of God's rescue plan. And that's a part of God's story.
Throughout the Bible, there are a lot of people who get into sticky situations and had to be determined to come out the other side. One of the first people who comes to my mind is a guy named Joseph. We even did a whole play at the church about him. He was the youngest brother, the baby of the family. And because he was the youngest, he got treated a little bit differently. His dad loved him a lot and gave him a beautiful coat. His older brothers did not like him. So much so that one day, when they were out looking after the sheep, they sold him to be a slave. He worked as a slave in a different country, got thrown in jail for doing nothing wrong, but eventually won over the king of that country. At the end of the story, we learned that Joseph became the second in command to the king, saved the country from disaster, and ultimately ended up saving his brothers from starvation, even though they sold him as a slave. He is a perfect example of determination. He got into a lot of sticky situations, but stayed determined. And his determination ended up with him being a step below the king. Maybe we won't have the same cool story, but if we're determined, we can still change the world. It's time to get up and sing along to our next song.
It's time to play some music. It's time to make some noise. It's time to dance, clap your hands, don't stand still. Now let me hear you lose your voice. Come on, listen up. Let's go. Listen up, we got a reason why we're singing. Who I wanna be.
thank you for stopping in for another week of Kids Connection. We're so glad that you've been determined to stick with us.
Like always, keep your eyes out for God sightings, times in the week where you see God. Maybe it's a sunset. Maybe it's the feeling when your mom or dad hugs you. Maybe it's seeing people treat other people nicely.
Or you could look for little things that make a big difference.
Whatever it is, we hope that it helps you ignite your inner flame and helps you stay determined.
We'll see you all next week.
Bye!